Hey, APUSH Nation, welcome in. We're in an unusual setting today, which is right here in the classroom. And I just had a bunch of you guys in here today talking about civil rights movements for African American rights in the 1960s. I want to propel that discussion to talk about how the culture of the 1960s and all this radical change that was going on with African American civil rights and other movements like, of course, the Vietnam War, which we'll be into later this week, the legislation passed in Johnson's Great Society, which you guys are reading about tonight for homework. This all sort of snowballed into a whirlwind of civil rights activism throughout the 1960s. And the goal for today is to look at other key movements that occurred, not just with African American rights, although certainly African American civil rights demanded so much of the attention of the 1960s. Now, we're not going to cover this in class. So as an extension of some of the African American civil rights discussions we've had, we'll wrap up MLK tomorrow. I want to talk to you about the growing Black Power movement of the 1960s. Now, this concept of Black Power was actually unique from any of the other movements we looked at, which was the Nation of Islam, King, Malcolm X when he went off on his own. But the origins of the Black Power movement really do stem from a lot of the Black nationalism ideas that came about all the way back to Marcus Garvey. But the Black Power movement took up a very militant idea at the end of the 1960s. And the Black Power movement really resonated greatly with the tension that was embroiled with Vietnam. So when we talk about all the social protests of Vietnam, this is certainly going to raise make more sense, I guess, contextually for you. One of the leaders of the Black Power movement was a highly educated man named Huey Newton. And Huey Newton and others would form this, and the group actually, a lot of its base was in San Francisco, California area. Now, when you look at the Black Power movement, one of their greatest vehicles of sort of visceral demonstrations, or I guess you could say representations, symbolic representation, was a group that embraced the Black Power movement known as the Black Panthers. These, again, were young African Americans. That's one of the themes of most of the civil rights movement. Most of the people leading these crusades were young people. And so when it came to the Black Power and the Black Panther movement, they had young African Americans, and the approach was often quite militant. So that's where you see a great disparity between Martin Luther King's ideas of civil disobedience with the Black Panther movement, which was a part of the Black Power movement, and those groups, especially the Black Panthers, sometimes were viewed negatively in the eyes of many, even within civil rights groups. But ultimately, at the time, the end of the 1960s, when so much social uproar was going on surrounding the Vietnam War, the Black Power movement gained a very strong and formed a very important movement to attach to the civil rights movement. And maybe one of the most enduring symbols of the Black Power movement was at the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City. You may have seen this photo, but two African American athletes took the medal stand wearing a black glove. And on the gold medal stand, one athlete raised his right fist, and on the bronze medal, another athlete raised his left fist while wearing a black glove. This symbol, this photograph, iconic photograph, really represented much of the growing Black Power movement and for what it represented as a legacy in the United States, and is certainly a movement that was here to stay. Shifting gears from Black Power movement and the Black Panther movement, I want to get into the Chicano movement. And the Chicano movement is one that's very important in local Arizona history, primarily because one of the leaders of the Chicano movement, Cesar Chavez, was born here in Yuma and would end up dying here later in life. Now, the Chicano movement essentially was based upon advocating for greater rights for Mexican Americans, but also other Latin Americans in the United States as well. Now, we know the history of tension between immigrants and Americans due to nativist sentiments that go back to the 1800s. But remember that during the Great Depression, fear of immigrants rose steadily once again because of the fear of the loss of jobs. But during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt embraced the Mexican American community by encouraging them to come to the United States to fill voids, especially in the farming sectors of the American economy, through the Bracero program. Well, by the early 1960s, the Bracero program ended. The United States government put an end to the Bracero program after a deadly bus accident where over 30 Braceros were killed. And so America once again sort of distanced itself. And we're going to talk tomorrow in class about the immigration policies of Johnson's Great Society. So tensions between Mexican Americans, especially Mexican American farm workers, were ever present during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so due to the number of Mexican Americans that were in the United States and working in industries like grape harvesting and other crops in the Southwest and the West Coast, Mexican American workers tried to unionize and organize in ways that other labor union groups in America's history had done. And that's where Cesar Chavez came in. As a member of the Mexican American community here in Arizona, he was, along with Dolores Huerta was another instigating figure in the Mexican American Chicano movement. Those two names are ones that you should be aware of, Huerta and Chavez, because they helped organize what eventually became known as the United Farm Workers Union. And the UFW really was a landmark union that was created specifically to advocate and use some of the same techniques we've looked at throughout history: collective bargaining, strikes. And Chavez and Huerta were experts in organizing various groups of Mexican American farm workers into one union. The union was responsible for a number of strikes and work stoppages that ultimately led to greater pay, greater acceptance, greater toleration of the Mexican American community throughout the United States. So certainly here in Arizona, Cesar Chavez is hailed as someone of a very heroic figure. And in fact, in numerous states, although not Arizona, but California, for example, celebrates Cesar Chavez Day on March 31st, which was actually his birthday. I'm going to tell you another story real quick about 1960 civil rights that fits in here to our ballpark. And it's a quick story of what happened on November 20th, 1969, when 89 Native Americans, so I'm switching gears from Chicano movement to Native American protests in the 1960s. 89 Native Americans hopped aboard boats outside of San Francisco, and they journeyed to Alcatraz Island. Some of you may have visited Alcatraz Island because that's the location of the infamous prison that the United States had closed years before. And Alcatraz was basically just an unoccupied property of American land. Well, Native Americans, using rights that had been afforded to them from the Indian New Deal during Roosevelt's tenure of office, claimed that the former prison land was actually Native American property by, quote, the right of discovery, meaning that Native Americans had discovered the land in the first place, so that it was actually their land to settle. And for almost 2 years, almost, Native Americans actually lived and occupied in protest Alcatraz Island, which of course, like I said, was once a famed prison. And this was a really important moment in Native American civil rights, primarily because of how ostentatious a display this was. Unlike some of the other movements we've talked about with strikes or marches in Washington, Native Americans basically lived and occupied Alcatraz for almost 2 years until eventually they were forced off the island. And in San Francisco history or in Alcatraz history, I remember years ago going to visit Alcatraz as a kid, and this was truly one of those moments that I remember learning about on the island. So kind of neat story behind the Native American civil rights movement, which didn't really gain quite the traction that African American civil rights or Mexican American civil rights, but the Occupy Alcatraz, we'll just call it that for the time being, sort of was a precedent for other Occupy movements in modern times, like the Occupy Wall Street movement from the 2011-2012 era. And if you visit Alcatraz still to this day, you can still see some of the graffiti and the signs, and the history is now very much embraced as a part of this Occupy Alcatraz movement by Native Americans. who were trying to advocate for better Native American rights. And the last segment, I'm going to save the LGBTQ community civil rights for the 1970s. We'll get into that movement in the 70s, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the role of women's rights activism. A second wave of feminism is believed to have began in the 1960s, chiefly thanks to a watershed moment in women's rights history when a female writer, Betty Friedan, Friedan, wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique that was published in 1963. Now, The Feminine Mystique was a landmark book in the eyes of many of the 1960s and became a bestseller, mainly because Betty Friedan went after in writing, and she used numerous studies that she had published and used psychological studies and sociological studies as the framework for her research on women in the United States. And what her studies concluded were that most American women were quite miserable about their role in the code of domesticity, which we, of course, have talked a great deal about already this year. And Friedan's book attacked the notion of women being overly domesticated, that most women preferred to be out and amongst the society, in the working class, involved in that capacity. And so her book basically shattered the myth that many women preferred to be in the household. And she was very critical of that cult of domesticity that was pervasive amongst many women, even in the 1960s. So Friedan attacked that system and demanded women to be more active in social welfare, demanded women be more active in job and equal rights treatments. And without a doubt, her book ignited a flame that burned brightly throughout the 1960s and into other decades. After the success of Betty Friedan's book, she went on to form an organization called NOW, the National Organization for Women. And the National Organization for Women had a pivotal role in helping pass many of the legislation that you'll read about tonight, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which gave a legal mandate to end sexual discrimination in employment. Maybe one of the most landmark pieces of legislation ever passed in American history. Also, in 1963, there was an Equal Pay Act passed, and that, again, was on the heels of NOW, the National Organization for Women. Much of their fight and their lobbying went towards advocating for women to have a greater say in legislation of the civil rights era. Ultimately, NOW would stage a major protest, a work stoppages and protest, a march in the streets on the 50th anniversary of the women's rights, the Women's Suffrage Amendment. So on August 26, 1970, Betty Friedan and NOW organized a massive protest and march and strike in New York City, and this spilled over in other cities as well. So just really a tour de force was Betty Friedan and the NOW organization. And ultimately, their greatest contacts with NOW would be advocating for what eventually became known as the Equal Rights Amendment. And we'll talk about ERA and the Equal Rights Amendment greater when we get into 1970s civil rights, because that would become a hot topic. And the last thing I'll say about with women's rights in the 1960s is don't underestimate the power of science as well here, because in 1960, the Federal Drug Administration approved for the first time in U.S. history legal contraceptive, aka the pill. The pill became an instant hit amongst women in the United States, and by 1962, 1.2 million women were on the pill, and by 1963, 2.3 million women were using the pill as a form of contraceptive. But the controversy of the pill would go all the way to the Vatican, where eventually the Catholic Church weighed in on whether or not the pill was a moral issue amongst the Catholic Church. And what I can tell you without getting into too political or too religious a topic of conversation, we know that the pill is here to stay, and we know that the pill would not just set off a firestorm of controversy in the 1960s, it's also going to foreshadow one of the most important 1970s Supreme Court cases of Roe versus Wade, when it came down to the Supreme Court weighing in on abortion. So you've got all of this science and debate over contraceptive that sparked greater attention towards women's rights movements that, of course, now and the likes of Betty Friedan were so heavily advocating for. So kind of a whip around here. I went about 15 minutes or so. Hopefully you guys were able to get a lot out of this. And we'll pick up tomorrow with talking about Johnson's Great Society. So if you have any questions on any of the material we covered today, please don't hesitate to ask in class tomorrow. I wish you guys a good evening. Good luck with the reading. Take care. Past shapes the future.